And today we're going to discuss prosocial behavior such as helping and cooperation. So here is our warm-up. One evening, just as you settle down to study for an important test, an acquaintance from down the hall in your dormitory enters your room. He or she asks for assistance with some homework, which is due the next morning. It turns out that you've already taken the same course in which your acquaintance needs help. Are you likely to help? How are you likely to help? Are there any costs if you help? Are there any rewards? Depending, of course, on the type of help and how much, you might have varying responses to this. For example, if the person just requires a very simple few minutes of re-explaining the work before they go on, well, that really might not be too much of a cost. If it requires several hours, you may not be able to study for your test. Of course, if they're asking for you to give them their work, well, that might be a whole different phenomenon. Here's another question for that. Would you treat a stranger differently? What are some circumstances that someone might need help and you are not likely to help? There are several types of prosocial behaviors, and that can include helping an individual in need, cooperating with others, sharing resources, and volunteering your time. I'm mostly going to be focusing on those top two because the latter two, well, frankly, are usually incorporated into one of the top two as well. So here is the joke for the day. A big burly man visited the pastor's house and asked to see the minister's wife, a woman well known for her charitable impulses. Madam, he said in a broken voice, I wish to draw your attention to the terrible plight of a poor family in this district. The father is dead, the mother is too ill to work, and the 9 children are starving. They're about to be turned into the cold, empty streets unless someone pays the rent, which amounts to $400. How terrible, exclaimed the preacher's wife. May I ask who you are? The sympathetic visitor applied his handkerchief to his eyes. I'm the landlord. Now we get to play a little bit of another game. Would you help this person? And why? What about this older gentleman right here? What about this younger gentleman? About this homeless gentleman who's looking for work? He even has his resumes on hand. What about this older woman right here? Would you help her? What about this person? Would you help her? I think it's her. So the question becomes, you've made a decision for a whole bunch of those people, whether they are worth your time, whether they are not worth your time. So why would you help some strangers and not the others? Is there anything in particular that determined this and how you responded? So when do people help? One of the things is this concept of pluralistic ignorance. And the concept of pluralistic ignorance is basically finding out if they actually even need to help. And they don't necessarily ask the person. They really look for other cues as to what other people, if other people think something is an emergency. So if somebody falls down, the person might look around and see if anybody else is expressing concern. If they don't express concern, then they are less likely to also feel like that they're going to go express the concern and ask the person if they're all right. The long and the short of this situation ends up being that people are less likely to help. So if you need help, how might you counteract pluralistic ignorance? There might be a variety of ways. one of which may potentially be signaling somebody clearly to see if they will do it, since they've been signaled out and are now different from the rest of the group. That might be a possibility. Otherwise, you may just have to wait until somebody decides to go check and see, at which point a whole bunch of others will probably also break apart and go see if something is needed or not. When do people help? Well, there's this concept of diffusion of responsibility that comes up from time to time as well. This is a situation where everybody looks around and goes, well, somebody else will do it. Somebody else will do it. Somebody else will do it. And as a result, nobody does anything. In the CPR classes that many people have taken, at one point they say, when you're at the patient and you realize you might need additional help, you say, hey, you, and you specify a particular person to go get help, go call 911, go do whatever they need to do, or whatever you're asking them to do. That puts all that responsibility on that particular person, also in a way that a lot of other people can see it as well. So this is why you always specify that. The problem is, the thing about this whole diffusion of responsibility comes from other situations, such as Kitty Genovese. This was a situation where there very well may have been an issue of diffusion of responsibility. The story goes, and some recent information has come to light saying this is not the exact story that was published, but in the psych literature, it is usually used to represent a situation where this young lady, she was coming home to her apartment, and she was attacked. And the murderer stabbed her, and then she was still alive. And something happened, the murderer ran off and then came back to finish the job, all while she was yelling and carrying on. The story goes that nobody did anything because they always felt it was somebody else's responsibility. There's now some evidence to suggest that some people at least tried to call the police, but for whatever reason the police didn't respond, or there was some other issue. But she still serves as a purpose of this diffusion of responsibility. This comes from a New York Times article, which is how this all came about. But we have her to thank for a lot of work in this area, at the very least. But, so if you need help, how do you counteract diffusion of responsibility? You very well might specifically say, hey, you with the blankety blank mask or shirt or whatever. That might be a way to put that thing, that help, specifically on that person, especially if you are the victim of that. When do people help? Well, a lot of the times things come down to costs and rewards. It's as simple as that frequently. If something is fairly low cost, you're more likely to do it than if it was a very, very large cost. Meanwhile, it's also that you're more likely to do things if there's a high reward as opposed to a lower reward. Now, if you see this photo, there's a couple of people that are helping an older gentleman, basically walk to his destination, or at least cross the street. That only took a few seconds of their time, realistically. So what? They're slightly late to go to the restaurant, 1 or 2 minutes. But they have some good rewards, internal rewards, if they feel that they did something good. Now, if there was a situation that was a huge cost and no reward, they probably were much less likely to do something like that. But that's what things come down to. Looking at that dorm example earlier on, if there's not much that you're going to be getting out of something, but you could be wasting 4 or 5 hours helping somebody when you should be studying for a test, you're probably not going to do that. Now, if this was a very, very low stakes test, or that you already felt very confident in that, you might want to spend the time to help a little bit as far as helping the other person. But usually you're going to get some type of reward out of that. Maybe the other person's offering to bake you cookies or something. Who knows? So, who helps? Who tends to help more? Men or women? Really, there really isn't a difference overall. And that's basically a fact. People might say, "Oh, men are more are less likely to help," but that's not what the stuff shows. I guess it all depends on what you're looking for. Who tends to work out more in dangerous situations? In that case, men are way more likely to help, and people are also more likely to accept the help as well. So, why is all of this? It could be a situation of the cost-benefit analysis. Women may feel that getting involved in something more dangerous is a bigger cost. They could lose their life. They could get injured. Somebody else could attack them who might not attack a guy. That is logical. A guy, on the other hand, may decide that the costs, they don't really need to worry as much because nobody's going to hit it. They might be more able to hold their own in a fight or whatever. And they may want to look really good and have that hero feeling, and that could be their benefit. There also could be a huge thing about socialization. If men are more likely to be socialized to help in a dangerous situation, and women want to avoid that and are more likely to help in a non-dangerous situation, well, that's part of this concept of socialization. In addition, it turns out that a lot of women will turn down help from men in many circumstances. Kids will turn down help from men in many circumstances, even if that person is very clearly not a threat to anybody. But a whole lot of this just simply comes down to that feeling of we shouldn't trust this other person, because people are socialized to think men are frequently a danger, even though only a small percentage of men are actually a danger to society. But hard to say which percentage, which particular person. So who tends to be more helpful? People who tend to be more helpful are the ones who tend to rank high on the 5-factor test in agreeableness. They are way more likely to at least try to help. Maybe this is because they really can't say no. Maybe it's just part of their character. Who else helps? People that have this thing called a prosocial personality orientation. And basically that means that there are these two components. One of them is that they really have a very strong idea of empathy. They really can understand what it's like, or what the other person feels, the person who is in need. They really have that empathy. They also are more likely to think that their helpfulness is useful. They've been helpful in the past, and they will want to be helpful again in the future. So people with this personality orientation are more likely to help as well. Why help? Well, there's a lot of evidence to suggest that there's evolutionary roots that are a big factor of why we help other people. That includes stuff like kin selection. With kin selection, you are more likely to help your relatives, particularly your closer relatives, although it could go out to, you might be more willing to help your cousins than, say, a complete stranger. Part of this is because you are more likely to help them pass down their genes, and thus increasing your own fitness to some extent. In this case, your kids might be more direct fitness, your cousins more indirect fitness, but it's still a situation of fitness. Your genes are still getting down into society. There's also this concept of reciprocal altruism, which realistically is usually not necessarily your family. It's usually more strangers. And it basically says that you're going to help others that have helped you in the past. So if you're more likely to have experienced help from person X, you're more likely to help them down the road. Maybe person X needed help moving, and then you help them, and maybe they'll help you move the next time that you have to do so. You can see this, of course, in buying meals. That's easy. I'll buy a meal for you 1 week, you'll buy it the next week. And here we have a video about a little bit more about the evolutionary history, as well as the neuroscience of basically compassion and why we help people.
One of the hardest questions when you think about the evolution of the human species from the standard framework of evolution, which really is about individual survival, competing, getting your genes to the next generation. One of the hardest questions within that framework is, why are people so frequently and routinely good and generous and sacrificing, right? And most people think that Darwin had this idea of survival of the fittest, that really it's the most ruthless and bloodthirsty who really thrive and survive. That is not Darwin's view of human evolution at all. He really felt that sympathy is the strongest instinct that humans have. Communities that have the most sympathetic members will flourish and raise the greatest number of offspring. That notion of Darwin's led to this sense that out of the vulnerability of our offspring emerged, first of all, social structures like cooperative caregiving, and then also physiological systems shaped by evolution to help us take care of the carriers of our genes, our offspring. We have learned from neuroscience down at UCLA that if you feel physical pain, a part of your brain lights up, and if I see you have that physical pain, the same part of my brain lights up. It's as if we're wired to have the same experience of other people. Empathy is this really complicated task. It really engages the frontal lobes, these newer regions of the cortex that are involved in more complex symbolic processes like language and imagining the future. Because empathy requires that you think there's someone else out there who has feelings and thoughts that may be different from mine. That's a really complicated cognitive achievement. In my lab, the Berkeley Social Interaction Lab, we showed images of prototypical suffering to our participants. They trigger massively powerful reactions of compassion, and what we found in the brain is that a very old part of the brain called the periaqueductal gray, which is common to mammals when they take care of things, lights up when you feel compassion. So that tells us compassion is really old in the nervous system, as Darwin speculated. My students and I got really interested in social class. What does it do to the human mind? Our lab and other labs are interested in something called the vagus nerve. It's the longest bundle of nerves in the human nervous system. In our research, compassion, the feeling of caring for someone in need, activates the vagus nerve. Lower class individuals, if we show them images of suffering, they have a vagus nerve response. You don't see that in upper class individuals. It literally is a compassion deficit that's produced by lots of wealth. Next set of studies on charity. Who gives? Economic analyses would say, if I have a lot of money, it should be easy to give. If I have $900 in my bank account, giving away money it really matters. It matters what you put in your fridge. And in spite of that, what we find is lower class individuals give more, and this is replicated in studies of philanthropy. You know, one of the things that this science tells us is there is enormous strength in these poorer communities of generosity and empathy that, you know, many people in more privileged circumstances miss. It's strong community. Yeah, you know, 60% of what we do is really about maximizing an individual's personal gratification and desire, just the classic survival of the most competitive. But 40% of the time, we're really doing things for other people. And we sacrifice and we risk exploitation and we still do it. And not only that, but it actually becomes personally fulfilling and inspiring to engage in that work. We find these secondary delights in acting on behalf of others. And I think that it really requires that we have to redefine human self-interest. You know, the great ethical traditions have always been encouraging this. And now we're seeing the science say, yeah, the brain really cares about other people.
So that is a great little thing about the research that's also being done about compassion, at least as of this moment.
One of the hardest questions when you think about the evolution of the human species from the standard framework of evolution, which really is about individual survival, competing, getting your genes
Of course, we don't always do things out of that whole compassion. Some people have, well, kind of selfish reasons for doing things as well. So you can help out of ego, and in order to make yourself feel better, you're helping yourself. You're also helping the other person, but you're more concerned with helping yourself. We have a few models about this. One of them is called the negative state relief model, and basically you're doing things to improve your own self, your own mood perhaps. So maybe you're in a really, really bad state of mind for whatever reason. You had a bad day at work. But you're aware that that we might feel better when we help somebody else. And so you go off and you help somebody, and then your mood gets better. So bad mood in there, and you're gaining that whole positive mood there. And then there's another one that probably is easy to confuse, but it is a different thing, and that's this arousal cost-reward model. In this case, you're still trying to get rid of a negative mood and gain a more positive mood, but realistically, this is because we started feeling bad about when we saw the other person that was in need. In the first one, that negative state, it doesn't really have, or doesn't seem to have anything to do with how that mood came about, or like you said, you already had that mood. The arousal is basically you see someone, you feel bad, and now you help them, so they feel, you feel less bad. You start feeling a little bit better. But this comes down to, the victim is who made you feel bad, is basically what it is. And both of these things, manipulate you at any time to do this or that or the other. Some places actually play on that. So the whole thing about some of the commercials with the injured animals, you were probably not in a bad mood prior to that commercial. Maybe you were, I don't know. I know those commercials tend to make me sad, and they do that. So now you feel really bad, and now if you donate money, you'll feel better. So they're purposely going after that cost-reward model regarding arousal, just by showing the injured animals. Another thing as to why help, well, you also can have altruistic motives. I mean, that's not unheard of. A lot of people always will say that's why they're doing things. For example, when going into medical school, they always say they want to help others. I guarantee you very few of them actually do, but that's what sounds good on a medical school application. A lot of them are in it for the money or for status, because status is huge. But there are people who really are altruistic, and part of that can be through this empathy altruism model. Basically, in this model, you're able to take the perspective of another person, and a surprising amount of people really can't do that. But maybe in this image that we're showing, they have a guy that's helping a younger guy, maybe a younger brother or shorter friend or whatever, with a broken foot. Maybe he can put himself in his friend's position. Maybe he's previously injured his foot. Maybe that's what's triggering that. It's certainly an option. And another one is that's the empathetic concern. And the other one is that personal distress. So in that case, with the personal distress, because the example I gave actually was empathetic concern, sorry for not hitting the thing earlier, personal distress is a distress when we can't necessarily take another person's perspective. So we help anyway, because we just don't understand what they're going through, so we desperately want to help, because that'll also make us feel better too, but it's more of a situation of we can't, I really don't understand how this is, basically how can I help you, and that's a situation of not really fully understanding. So either completely understanding or distress at not being able to understand, those can frequently lead to these altruistic motives. And now for something a little different. Before I start this, I want you to think about what you would do and how you would react.
Welcome back to Golden Balls. After a run of big cash balls, Ibrahim and Nick now have £13,600 in front of them. We know they've got it, but the golden question is, can they keep it? Ibrahim and Nick, you now face a very straightforward choice, but it's a choice that could make one or both of you extra wealthy, but it could also lose both of you everything that you have fought for today. They have to decide to split or steal. Ibrahim, Nick, you have two final golden balls in front of you, and they are the most important golden balls of the game. You each have a golden ball with the word split written inside. You both have a ball with the word steal written inside. You will know which is split and which is steal because you're going to have a look. If you both pick the split ball, you split the 13,600 and you go home with 6,800 each. If one of you chooses the steal ball and the other chooses the split ball, whoever chooses the steal ball goes home with the whole lot, 13,600. But if you both choose the steal ball, you leave today's game with what you came with, nothing. It's the ultimate test of faith, trust, and let's face it, greed. Take a moment to look at the balls in front of you so you know for definite which is split and which is steal, but obviously keep them concealed from each other. Just have a look. Okay. It's the easiest choice, but the most difficult one. What I want you to do is to spend half a minute talking to each other about what you both should do. Nick, Ibrahim.
Ibrahim, I want you to trust me. 100% I'm going to pick the steel ball.
Sorry, you're going to...
I'm going to choose the steel ball.
You're going to take the
I
steel?
want you to do split, and I promise you that I will split the money with you.
Well, after you've took the steel?
Yeah.
You're going to take steel?
Yeah.
I'm going to take split?
Yeah.
So you take the money?
And I will split it with you.
After the show?
Yeah. Ibrahim, I promise you I'll do that. If you do steal, we both walk away with nothing. I'm telling you 100%
No,
I'm going to do it.
I appreciate that. Right, I'll give you another alternative. Why don't we just both pick split?
I'm not going to pick split. I'm going to steal. Ibrahim, honestly, 100% I'm going to steal.
It's in your nature to steal.
No, I'm honest, and I'm going to tell you...
You're an honest
I
man.
am. That's why I'm telling you I'm going to steal. If you do split, then I will split the money.
I can't see myself doing that.
Okay, well, I'm going to steal, so we're going to leave with nothing.
Where's your brains coming from? I can't work out...
I know that I'm a decent guy, and I will split the money with you.
Well, we should just both split then.
No, I'm going to do steal.
There is no legal requirement
there is.
for him to give you the money.
Of course. If I gave you my word... Now, let me tell you what my word means.
Okay.
My father once said to me, a man who doesn't keep his word is not a man. He's not worth nothing. Not worth a dollar.
I agree.
So...
Ibrahim, I'm going to steal. So you've got the choice. You either steal, and we both walk away with nothing. Because you know, I've told you my intention, and I've told you that I will split the money with you, Ibrahim.
If I gave you my word that I was going to split, I would split. And you're going to take steal, so...
The only way you can guarantee to walk away with 6,800
is by
to
sharing.
guarantee that you both put the split ball in. And I do now have to push you for a decision. It's a tough one.
We've lost it. We've lost everything.
Okay, lost then.
We're walking away with no money because you're an idiot.
No, that's not
You're an
true.
idiot. You're an idiot. That's what you are. You're an idiot. You're an idiot. That's what you are.
This can go on all night, and these people have got to get up for breakfast. Nick, choose split or steal. Ibrahim, choose split or steal. Now, please. Choose a ball.
Right, I'll tell you what, I'm going to go with you.
Okay.
I'm going to go with
I promise you I will split it.
You cannot change your balls now. Split or steal? Yes! Congratulations, you're both split and each received £6,800.
Why did you put me through that? Why did you do it to me? You're the worst person I've ever met. That was a good one, wasn't it?
Well, it's charity all the way.
I know,
And a market trader you can really trust. Congratulations to you both. I've been Jasper Carrot. This has been a remarkable game. They've been lovely. This has been Golden Balls. Until next time, goodbye.
Now I've won the money. I feel drained. I feel drained. That was the hardest money I've ever had to work for.
I feel...
So that is an interesting situation right there. And that leads us to the discussion of game theory and what we're about to discuss, cooperation. I think all of us have some general idea as to what cooperation is, and that is working together for a common goal. And you can tell there's also a situation including, defection, where one person could try to cooperate and one person might decide not to, as you saw in that video. God only knows what he was actually trying to do, except for to psych people out. But in the end, they did cooperate. Cooperation has been a part of human life since before Homo sapiens were Homo sapiens. We have evidence of various forms of cooperation going back hundreds and hundreds of thousands of years. Because cooperation is so important to humans and our society, we are very interested in studying it. And there are a lot of games that you can teach that are very, very basic, but there are cooperative learning exercises and to see if somebody's willing to cooperate or not. We have found that kids as young as 14 months have a concept of cooperation. And this is a pretty remarkable idea. Even though this is around the time they're still kind of egocentric, they're still willing to cooperate with another person. We've also trained non-human primates to do various games, and which have basically do involve cooperation. That basically both people have to work together to get a specific goal, or people can, if one wants to cooperate and the other one says no, well, one person gets nothing, one of them gets a little something. The defector gets basically rewarded. In other situations where everybody defects, they have their own thing going on. And this has been used in several, like I said, non-human primates. And you also see stuff to some extent in other animals, although whether the particular game I'm thinking of is done in other animals, I can't really remember. Because I'm thinking of the stag hunt game, which I know has been trained in several groups. But you still see other animals being willing to cooperate. You see this in, the bigger cats. You see this in birds and ants to some extent. And you'll see this, of course, in wolves and such as well. A bunch of animals actually do have some form of cooperation. And when we deal with with cooperation, frequently we do some type of game. And this is what makes some of the research so interesting, and in some ways so much fun. So look at what we have here. Let's say we were going to divide everybody in the classroom up into two groups. One group we're going to be proposing something, and the other was going to be responding and seeing if they accepted the proposal. So I give somebody, I set aside $10 for each team. And what the proposer has to do is make a deal with the responder, how they would split the money. Now the thing is that if the proposer asks the responder, and the responder says yay, sure, that's how they'll split the money. If it turns out that the responder is like no, then nobody gets any money at all. So this is one of those types of ultimatum games. So think about what would happen if you and your classmates would actually do this game. What would you do? Assuming you did that, what do you think is the most common proposal, and why do you think that might be? The most common proposal is usually around 50-50. However, that doesn't mean that that's the average proposal. That's just the most common proposal. The average proposal is usually 60-40, with a slight favor in favor of the proposer. And how many people, if they've made these options, what percentage of things do you think might have been rejected by the responder? If you said somewhere around 20%, well, you were correct. If people do this, there will always be a few people that will try to, take everything for themselves. Maybe the proposer says, I'll take 9, you do 1. Certainly, the responder will be a little bit ahead. The proposer will be very ahead, but this isn't necessarily fair. So that is more likely to get rejected, depending on how the responder thinks about all of this. But there are a lot of games that really come into discussing this whole cooperation phenomenon. One of which is the prisoner's dilemma. And let me just show you about the prisoner's dilemma and what that is.
Let's say Mr. Blue and Miss Red have each been arrested for some minor crime. The police think they committed a more serious crime, but they don't have enough evidence to convict them. They need a confession. They take them and put them in separate rooms. Let's say Mr. Blue and Miss Red have each been arrested for some minor crime. The police think they committed a more serious crime, but they don't have enough evidence to convict them. They need a confession. They take them and put them in separate rooms so they can't talk, and play a little game. To try to force a confession, the police give them each a choice. Admit your partner committed the crime and you will go free. We'll pardon you for the minor crime, but your partner will have to spend 3 years in prison. If you stay silent and your partner lets us know that you were the one who really did it, then you're going to have to go away for 3 years. They know that the police don't have any evidence, and if they both stay silent, then they will only go to prison 1 year each for the minor crime. If they both betray each other, then they'll both go to prison for 2 years each. Okay, each partner can do one of two things: stay silent or betray. Staying silent would be cooperating, and betraying would be defecting. If they both stay silent, then they each spend a year in prison. If one betrays and the other stays silent, then the betrayer goes free and the silent spends 3 years in prison. If they both betray, then it's 2 years each. So what are they going to do? Well, they should cooperate. That's the best option for the group if we add the total number of years in prison. But let's take it from Red's perspective. If she thinks Blue is going to stay silent, then she should betray so she can go free. Going free is better than spending a year in prison. If she thinks he's going to betray her, then she should definitely betray. 2 years in jail is better than 3 and being made a fool of. Blue is in the exact same situation and will think the exact same thing. He should betray if she stays silent, and he should betray if she betrays. They should have both cooperated, but from an individual standpoint, they notice they could always gain by defecting, if they have no control over what the other person's going to do. So they'll both defect to try to better their own situation, but come away not only hurting the group, but themselves. Individually, they're worse off than if they both cooperated. This situation is pretty made up, but it has some real-world analogs. A common example is with marketing. Let's say 2 cigarette companies, Red Strikes and Smooth Blue, are deciding how much money they should spend on advertising. Since the product they each make is identical to one another, advertising has a huge impact on sales. For simplicity, let's say their choices are to advertise a bunch or not advertise at all. And there's just 100 people in the society and they all smoke. If both don't advertise, then just by random chance picking cigarette boxes, 50 people buy Red Strikes and 50 people buy Smooth Blue. At $2 a pack, they each make $100. Let's say advertising costs $30. If one person advertises and the other does not, then 80 people will buy the cigarettes from the ads and 20 people buy the other ones. The advertiser makes $160 minus $30 for ads and comes away with $130. The non-advertiser didn't spend any money but only made $40. If they both advertise, again, half will buy Red Strikes and half will buy Smooth Blue. But since they both spent $30 on advertising, they only come away with $70 each. Same deal, both people cooperating and not advertising is the most preferable situation, but both companies can see that advertising will always make them more money. But unlike the prisoners in jail, these companies can talk and try to influence each other. From here, Blue would be better off if Red didn't advertise. Red wouldn't go for that because that would be worse for them. Blue could try to convince Red that they would both not advertise, the only other situation where they're both better off. But without any real obligation to each other, there's nothing that's stopping them from trying to advertise to gain more of the market anyway. If you think your opponent's going to not advertise, then you're better off advertising. Although we're still making assumptions to make this situation work too. With this model, we're assuming they only play once. The game changes when the players have a chance to build a relationship and work together to get more gains over time, or punish each other by not cooperating. Also, to make the model work, we have to make up rules for the players. Assume they're basically computer programs with predictable actions. These guys are creepier than they were in my head. They were supposed to be cute. For the prisoner's dilemma and other similar models, we're assuming they are rational agents. A rational agent is a hypothetical person that will always pick the option that they predict will work out best for them. They're not really thinking about the gains of someone else. Seems selfish, but it is something that real people generally do too. People always want what's best for themselves, and we don't like to be made a fool of. But if you put real people in the prisoner's dilemma, people don't always defect like the model predicts. In one study, 40 people playing prisoner's dilemma games through a computer without ever meeting or talking, only playing each opponent once, these are one-off games, using a payoff matrix that looks like this, cooperated an average of 22% of the time. These people never cooperated, these people always cooperated, these guys cooperated on half of their games and everyone else is in between. This is a lot of cooperation coming from a model that predicts no cooperation. The largest group did act like rational agents, but most people tried to cooperate at least once. It's because, well, there's more to real people. We are social creatures, and even in one-off scenarios with no guarantees or obligations and no chance to build a relationship, we're still thinking about how the group might decide. We're actually thinking from the perspective of the group and making an optimistic decision. Cooperating an average of 20% of the time might not seem very optimistic, but remember this is with absolutely no communication or obligations. Anyways, that's not really the point. Using rational agents is still useful. The model is just trying to point out the dilemma of certain situations where people are actually hurt.
So there are actually many other games that do the prisoners that do things like the prisoner's dilemma. There's actually an entire branch of things in what is called game theory. Cooperation is not the only thing that studies, but that is one of the main things that it studies. It's very, very frequent. Of course, we always have this tendency of, do we cooperate or do we act selfishly? And that's really what game theory is trying to figure out. It's like, well, how are we choosing to act one way or the other? and and why. What are the factors, and why are we doing it? There are a lot of individual differences in cooperation. Your book covers at least a few of them, although there are many more things, and we're learning more all the time. One of the things your book talks about is this concept of social value orientation, and that there are three basic types that everybody is looking at. Well, everybody basically falls into one of these groups. And the cooperative person is usually willing to cooperate, of course, more, and have very, very similar, if not the same, things. They're more likely to, say, split things in half. If, for example, on that ultimatum game, they're probably going to prefer to offer a 50-50 cut. If you're going to look at somebody individualistically, a lot of people will pick whatever the option is that's best for them, regardless of any other factor. So they may be more likely to really pick whatever it is that they're going to get the more benefit of, regardless of what you're going to get. And in the situation of competitive, the whole purpose of competitive is to basically do better than the person that they're competing against. They might get the same amount of money as a different group, provided their particular opponent is getting less than they are. So that's not quite the same thing as individualistic things, but certainly it falls into the category of they're not as cooperative as one would be. Other individual differences in cooperation, including empathetic ability. And basically, we've already discussed that in a little bit earlier, that you need to be able to understand what it is like to be in the other person's shoes. That's basically what that really comes down to. If you can't see what it's like, maybe put yourself in their position, it might be much more challenging to be able to reach out and cooperate in that issue. There are a lot of situational influences regarding cooperation as well, and that includes stuff like communication and commitment. Especially with the situation of communication, if you go off and do a thing in game theory, I can think of a few games in particular, they have found that people who are more likely to, of course, communicate, they're more likely to end up cooperating on whichever way they're cooperating, which kind of makes sense. This actually even happens even if they are paying to some extent to communicate. And the more they're willing to spend, they're also more willing to cooperate as well, which is kind of interesting. There's also this issue of trust. If you don't trust the person, you're not going to cooperate with them. If it turns out that you are, in a situation where you just have seen this guy act before, they've never acted particularly nice to you, you're going to not work with them. If you're in a situation where this person has defected in the past, you also may be more likely to choose to defect early. There's also be something to be said for stuff like group identification. If you identify with a particular group, you're more likely to help that group than any others. So they did a situation where they had a different group of, I think it was in India, it was like people from different castes. Certain castes, especially when playing each within their own caste, they were more likely to cooperate than from somebody from a different caste. Meanwhile, if they were in a different caste situation, the higher caste was frequently less likely to cooperate with somebody lower than that. And this partially comes down to this whole concept of social identity. And social identity is way more than just that, to be honest. It can be anything along those lines, any form of group. You may be more likely to help somebody who, if you perceive them to be a fellow student, than as a faculty member. Of course, the culture that you grow up in can also affect your cooperation. For example, that ultimatum game with the money where you split it, that might change. What's more likely to be played might depend in part on your culture. Some groups might be completely fine with an 80-20 split, for example, and they have shown that. But a lot of things depend on that. There's also some differences in collectivist cultures versus individualist cultures, and each group, there's of course that, but subsections all tend to play things a little bit differently. So if you're ever interested in anthropology and psychology combined, this might be an interesting area of study for you. So here are some discussion questions. Some Buddhist traditions believe that the goal in life is to be happy, and that the path to happiness is to make others happy. What do you think? Do you think that sex and gender differences in the frequency of helping and the kinds of helping have changed over time? Why? Do you think that we might expect more changes in the future? Do you think that we can do things for purely altruistic motives? Or do we always benefit on some level when we help others? If resources are finite, I swear I can talk, and you as the individual or member of society uses a disproportionate amount of resources compared to someone else, would you be willing to give up some of your resources to support a larger population on the whole, even if your standard of living might decline? Why or why not? Also, is cooperation always the right answer? As always, if you have any questions, drop an email or send me a comment, whatever you need. And thank you so much for talking to me.